Welcome to the second lesson in the series on hormonal communication. Today's lesson will be about the fight or flight response. If we refer to the specification, we're going to be covering the structure and function of the adrenal glands, which are an endocrine gland, and particularly looking at the structure of the cortex and the medulla. And we will also be looking at how the response of the nervous system and endocrine systems interact to produce fight or flight. The obvious place to start is with the structure of the adrenal glands. We have two, and they are situated on the top of each kidney, and they look like little sort of caps sitting on the top of each one. If we look inside each gland, we'll find that it's made up of two distinct areas. We've got an outer region, which is the cortex, and an inner region, which is the medulla. And these two terms, medulla and cortex, tend to be used quite frequently in lots of different organs. You probably can just about remember hearing about the cortex in the kidney and the medulla in the kidney. And it basically means, medulla means the middle and the cortex means the outer region. So on our diagram over here, we've got the medulla in the middle, the cortex on the outside, and the kidney there at the bottom. This diagram just shows the adrenal glands in relation to the entire kidney. So you can see there that they sit on the top of each kidney as if it's like a little sort of hat. First of all, the cortex. Hormones are produced from the cortex, and this is controlled by hormones released from the pituitary gland. So we actually have the nervous system and the endocrine system interacting with each other to control when it's released. And the cortex is producing steroid hormones, so that means these are hormones which are not water soluble. And the examples of these ones are cortisol and aldosterone. And these are both hormones which are released during times of stress, and they tend to be not stress as in I've just had a fright, but usually where people have ongoing stress, maybe a situation which causes them long-term worry. Cortisol and aldosterone levels will rise in the blood. When we look at the medulla is producing the hormones called adrenaline and noradrenaline, and that again is in response to stress, but that tends to be more immediate stress. Although if you have long-term stress, those two hormones will be raised in your blood. So sometimes you will see that term adrenaline, and sometimes you will see it as epinephrine, which I'll come on to in another slide, but it's exactly the same hormone, just with a different name. They belong to a group of hormones called catecholamine hormones, and basically what that means is that they are amino acids which have extra bits attached to them. So the fight or flight response is probably something you're very familiar with. It's an instinct that all mammals possess, and it's in response to a threat. And the body prepares itself to respond to a perceived threat. So the obvious thing is either you're going to stand and fight or you're going to run away. And quite honestly, more often than not, organisms actually run away. And they will often not fight unless there is no alternative given to them, simply because you stand a much better chance of surviving if you can outrun your predator rather than trying to fight it. Before we go on to the hormonal side of the fight or flight response, we'll quickly have a look at the part that the nervous system plays. Now, the nervous system is a part of the course that you're going to be studying fairly soon, but we haven't done that yet. So I'm just going to outline very quickly the way that the nervous system is organised. Some of it you will probably already know. Now, to start with, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system are the two halves of the overall nervous system. So, as I'm sure you know, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system are all the nerves that lead off the central nervous system. So for example, all the sensory and motor neurons. We can see that in this diagram here. So we've got the central nervous system there on the left with the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves that are leading off, and those ones will supply organs and all the body's parts, fingers, legs, all those things. So those nerves are going to be doing a variety of jobs, including detecting changes in the body and also in the environment. Now, the peripheral nervous system can be divided up into two halves. We have the somatic nervous system, and that includes the part of the nervous system where we make conscious decisions. So these are voluntary movements, so for example walking, raising our hands, doing anything that we make a decision to do, that's going to be part of the somatic nervous system. We also have something called the autonomic nervous system, and this is where the nervous system that controls involuntary movements, and a good example of this would be something like peristalsis. Quite a lot of the things that happen in the body happen without us having to make a conscious decision to do it. So we don't sit there thinking, I need to move all the food through my intestines, so I'm going to start contracting that dinner right through to my duodenum. That's already happening whether we are thinking about it or not. The way in which our pupils change size is all under the control of the autonomic nervous system. Now, there is one more level. The autonomic nervous system can be divided up into two halves. These two halves are called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. They work in opposition to each other in the way that they respond to the circumstances around you. So simply put, the sympathetic nervous system is involved in stimulating activity, and the parasympathetic nervous system is involved in dampening down activity. And we're going to see this on the next slide, which compares the activities of the two. So here we can see a comparison of the type of actions that occur when the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system are being stimulated. So you might be in a situation where there is a perceived threat. You might be nervous because you have to do something which is frightening or something unfamiliar, and that will trigger the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system will cause a range of activities in the body that activate various different processes. So for example, at the top you can see that the pupils get wider, so you have a greater ability to see what's going on around you. If you're nervous, you quite often find that you lose your appetite, and that's partly to do with also things like reduced amount of saliva, so you get a dry mouth. Your heart rate goes up, and you will find that you might have a sort of fluttery feeling in your stomach, and that's to do with the reduced amount of peristalsis in the digestive system. So this really directs all of the blood flow and the activity away from the non-essential parts of the body for that particular moment, so things like the digestive system and so on, and concentrates the activity to the parts of the body where you are ready for action, so particularly for things like muscles and so on. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system is reducing activity, so our pupils get smaller. We might find that we have more saliva in our mouth, which would be in a normal situation if we were sitting down to eat. People tend to eat when they feel safe and secure. They don't tend to feel like sitting down and having a big dinner when they're under threat. Our heart rate goes down, our breathing rate goes down. So these are all the things that we might associate with relaxation, maybe going to sleep. Now on the next set of slides, I'm going to be just having a look at the way the nervous system, in terms of the nerves, actually vary in the different parts of the nervous system. Now I know we haven't done nervous system just yet, so a lot of this will be reinforcing for the next topic, but if we just have a quick look at these, just to sort of link the two topics together, you can see there a typical neuron, motor neuron that we've got there, and this is part of the peripheral nervous system. So this will be the type of neuron that might, for example, be sent between the spinal cord and a leg muscle. And you can see we've got lots of myelin on the axon, and we've got over there, we've got another thing called the neurotransmitter, and this is on here is called ACH, which is a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And so all of this is all about being active. If we look at the sympathetic nervous system, again we've got neurons which we've got myelin, not as much myelin on these ones, and they will form synapses with neurons which don't have myelin. And the basic difference between these type of neurons is that the unmyelinated neurons tend to have slower transmission. And we've got a neurotransmitter there which is not the same as the one above, and it's noradrenaline. Also, we've just got showing here the way in which the neurons might be, for example, interacting with the adrenal gland, which we can see there, just to sort of link that part with something else. And at the bottom we've got the parasympathetic nervous system, so very similar to the neurons that we've got above, so lightly myelinated, also linked with unmyelinated neurons, and again using a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. I'm not expecting you to know anything about the neurotransmitters at this stage, but hopefully when you do the other part of the course you will be able to link these ideas together. Here is a diagram of the brain, and again, although we're not expecting you to know much about the brain at this time, it's quite a good idea just to be familiar with the main areas. We've got the cerebrum at the front, which is the sort of thinking part of the brain. We've got the cerebellum at the back of the head, and that would be a part of the brain which is to do with fine movements. And most importantly at this stage we're looking at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now the hypothalamus in green there is an important part of the brain, and the pituitary gland below it. And when you're in a normal situation, you will be sensing all the signals around you, so you might find yourself in a situation which you perceive as being dangerous. So those impulses, for example from the eyes, will arrive at the hypothalamus, and this is then going to activate two areas of the brain, which is then going to coordinate the fight or flight response. So the first one is the hormonal system, and that is part of what we call the adrenal cortical system, and this means that the brain is going to send messages to the adrenal cortex to release some hormones in response to this stressful situation. And also we're going to alert the sympathetic system, and the sympathetic system is going to send nervous impulses around the body, as we've seen earlier, to stimulate activity and get the body ready for action. It's worthwhile for us to have a look at the relationship that exists between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. This diagram shows how they are structured next to each other, and what we can see is we've got the hypothalamus there at the top, and inside the hypothalamus we've got neurosecretory cells, and we've also got below that we've got the pituitary gland, which is divided into two lobes. The anterior pituitary there on the left, and the posterior pituitary gland on the right. Sometimes they are drawn the other way round. It doesn't really matter which way round it is on the diagram, you just need to make sure you know which one you're talking about. And you'll notice as well that surrounding this pituitary gland we've got a blood vessels, capillary network, so that any of the chemicals that are secreted straight into the blood, which therefore obviously is part of the endocrine system. Now the hypothalamus is involved in making a range of different hormones. One of them you probably remember from GCSE, which is ADH, which is controlling the water levels in the kidney and in your body fluids. And another hormone which you may or may not have heard of, something called oxytocin, which is released by females during reproduction. It's particularly involved in breastfeeding, and also it's apparently the love hormone as well. So it might be made in the hypothalamus, but it's stored in the posterior pituitary gland, and it's there until it's been triggered. On the other side we've got the anterior pituitary gland, which actually has a range of other hormones in it. A hormone called ACTH, which you should have already found out something about, and if you haven't then you need to look it up, but we will be talking about that later. And two hormones that you probably remember from GCSE, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, which are all to do with ovulation, although they are also hormones which are found in males and have a slightly different role, but also again to do with gamete production. and these are made and stored in the anterior pituitary. So when the hypothalamus is stimulated by some kind of nerve impulse, what this will do is it will actually cause some of these hormones to be released into the pituitary gland, and then they will be released into the blood. So from this stimulation you can actually cause the hormones to be produced and released from the posterior pituitary. We see this in this diagram here, so I'm just going to run through the system here which links up the hormonal system and the nervous system. I'm just going to go through the events then that happen when a person experiences a stressful event. So the person experiences excitement or fear, and that stimulus arrives at the hypothalamus, and what that does is it causes the hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which is found in the anterior pituitary gland, to be released. And once it's released, it will travel in the blood until it reaches the adrenal cortex. Now, of course, like all hormones, it's just travelling in the bloodstream until eventually it finds a receptor where it has a complementary shape and it binds. So once it reaches the adrenal cortex, the outer region, it will bind to it. When it's there, it will activate many of the hormones from the cortex. And two of the main hormones at this point are cortisol and aldosterone, as we mentioned earlier. And these hormones are going to help you cope with short-term and long-term stress. There has been quite a lot of evidence to suggest that raised levels of cortisol, particularly in the system, can result in people putting on weight, for example, because they comfort eat, or they sort of feel the need to sort of make themselves feel better by having a little bit more food, or eating in the evening, snacking, that type of thing. So we know that there is some evidence that those things are linked, and that's obviously a long-term response to stress, but also they are raised in short-term stress as well. So these are referred to as the stress hormones, so you can actually measure that in somebody and find out what their stress levels are. So the effects of cortisol and aldosterone include stimulating the conversion of proteins and fat into glucose, so you're raising your blood sugar. This is also actually known as a process called gluconeogenesis, but we're going to come back to that when we do blood glucose control. This increases the amount of energy available for the brain and the muscles so that you can respond to any situation. So it makes sense for the body to fuel you up so that you've got plenty of glucose available. But of course, an increase in glucose in the blood will cause an increase in blood pressure, because it has an osmotic effect on the blood, drawing water into the blood and increasing the blood volume, so blood pressure will go up. And it also increases the amount of sodium ions and water by the kidneys as well. The other thing it can do is it can have an effect upon suppressing your immune system, which may seem like a strange thing to do, but if you're under stress, then the body tries to preserve as much of its protein for more important things like producing muscle and various other things, and also converting some of that protein into glucose. And so therefore the body tries to reduce the amount of antibodies that are responding. So actually the immune system starts to be slightly ineffective, which is why people who are under stress tend to be unwell for other reasons as well. So it isn't just a sort of made up thing. Stress will make people more prone to other types of illnesses as well. So this whole thing, as we said, is an energy saving mechanism. In addition to the hormonal response of the hypothalamus is now going to trigger the sympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system is going to send an impulse to the adrenal glands as well, but it's going to be causing the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline into the blood, and that comes from a different area. So the sympathetic fibres here, you can see, are actually reaching into the medulla of the adrenal gland, and that's going to cause the release of these hormones, adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now you can see on this diagram they're called epinephrine and norepinephrine, but they are exactly the same thing, so don't be concerned if you see that term elsewhere. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are going to cause a range of different responses in the body, some of which you'll be very familiar with. So let's just quickly run through some of. The first response, which we're most familiar with, is an increase in heart rate. An increase in heart rate results in more blood being pumped to the muscles and the brain, and that is obviously a useful response because this increase in blood flow to our muscles allows us to increase the amount of oxygen and glucose that's being delivered to the muscles for respiration so that they can be more active. We might need to run away quickly, and also to the brain so we can think quickly. Now if we look at this diagram on the screen in front of you, what you'll see is you will see a range of different lines here, and each of those lines is showing the number of times the heart is beating. On the y-axis we've got the membrane potential, and if we just really assume that every time the membrane potential goes up, that relates to the contraction of the ventricles. So to start with, if we look at the resting heart rate, we can do a calculation. One heartbeat takes 0.8 seconds to be completed. So what we want to know is how many of these heartbeats we can fit into a minute. So 60 divided by 0.8 will give us 75 beats per minute, which is the average resting heart rate of an adult. If we compare this to what happens when the sympathetic nervous system is being activated. So the sympathetic nervous system is being activated, and now the heartbeat is only taking 0.6 seconds to be completed. So a simple calculation, again, that you might be asked to do in an exam might be to be working out the heart rate of two situations. So the active or the sympathetic nervous system heart rate will be 60 divided by 0.6, which gives us 100 beats per minute. And of course we could do the same thing for the parasympathetic, which is the line in blue. But it's a bit trickier on this one because we actually don't have the second peak, but you can see that it is likely to be a little bit longer than the other two, but it's hard to say for sure. The next thing that happens is we get a raise in blood sugar concentration. Now this is a process called glycogenolysis, and this happens in the liver. Now we've got on this diagram, if we look at the top of that diagram, epinephrine, which is basically adrenaline, and that's going to be picked up by the beta receptor, and inside that liver cell we've got lots of glycogen deposits. And then what happens is that adrenaline causes that glycogen to be broken down and then released from that cell, and that increase in glucose obviously increases the available substrate for respiration. Just to remind you that this term lysis means splitting. Another effect is that we get the widening of the air passages. So the bronchioles will expand a little bit, allowing more oxygen into our lungs, so that increases the potential for gas exchange, so we can pick up more oxygen and get rid of more CO2. As mentioned earlier, the pupils change size, and so when you are in a sympathetic system, the pupils become much wider, and that is affected by the way that you've got these two layers of muscles in the iris. You've got the radial muscles and the circular muscles, and the circular muscles contract, making the hole in the iris a lot smaller, and in order to do that the radial muscles are relaxing. And the opposite is happening when you have the sympathetic nervous system. Erector muscles in the skin contract, and this then makes your hair stand up on end. So when we are stimulated, sometimes we might find that we get goosebumps. Sometimes we get those when we're cold, but we have a great example here with a kitten that has been scared, and all her hair is standing up on end and looking incredibly cute as well. This process is really because the hair erector muscle that's attached to the hair is being stimulated and it's contracting, and that's making the hair stand up on end. Another thing that happens is a change in the blood flow around the body. So we get the narrowing of blood vessels supplying non-essential organs, so the skin and the gut. So somebody that has had a fright might suddenly become very pale, and that's because the blood flow has been directed away from the skin, and it's also being moved away from the gut. So you might look pale, you might feel a bit sick, and that's very common if somebody has been in a very frightening situation. If you've had a massive burst of adrenaline, you can actually start to feel a bit faint, and that's because of this process. And that's because the blood is now being diverted much more in much greater volumes to the heart and the lungs and to the skeletal muscles, and that allows us to respond by being able to perhaps run away a little bit quicker. We also get a stimulation of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm, which increases our breathing rate, so the sympathetic nervous system is speeding up the amount of gas exchange that's going on. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that noradrenaline is a hormone which is released by the adrenal medulla, but it is also a neurotransmitter found in neurons. So this is a chemical which coordinates the nervous response and the endocrine response. So if we look in this diagram here, we can see that we've got vesicles containing neurotransmitter, and these are the chemicals which are able to pass between the synapses between neurons, and different neurotransmitters exist in different parts of the body. So the brain has a range of different ones, and the most common one is something called acetylcholine, but we also see in the sympathetic nervous system a neurotransmitter called noradrenaline, and so that one is involved in stimulating the stress response, just like the hormone part of noradrenaline. All areas of the body have this innervation by the sympathetic neurons, so that allows the response to be localized, but also allows for the whole body to respond in coordination with itself. You should have this table which allows you to summarize the different effects of the sympathetic nervous system and the reason why those things need to happen. Obviously have a go at filling it in, but these are the reasons here. So heart rate increases to pump more oxygenated blood around the body. Pupils dilate to take in as much light as possible for better vision. The arterioles in the skin constrict, so more blood is passed to the major muscle groups like the heart and the brain. Blood glucose levels increase, which allows for increased respiration to provide the energy for muscle contraction. Smooth muscle of airways relax to allow more oxygen into the lungs. Non-essential systems like digestion shut down, and this allows all the resources to focus on the emergency part of the body. And the difficulty focusing on small tasks, the brain is focusing only on where the threat is coming from. This diagram is just to bring together the way in which the hypothalamus is able to trigger both the hormonal response, the endocrine response in the adrenal cortex, and also showing how the sympathetic nervous system is involved in that process as well. This flow diagram summarizes this process that we've just seen in the previous picture. So the hypothalamus has received some information and is stimulating a stress response. The first thing it does is it activates the adrenal cortical system by first of all releasing a hormone called corticotropin releasing factor, and this then travels down to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is then going to release the hormone adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. This is secreted into the blood, and where it travels down towards the adrenal glands. When it arrives at the adrenal glands, it will bind to the receptors on the adrenal cortex, and that will cause the stimulation of the release of a number of different hormones, including cortisol, and that one is then released into the blood. At the same time, the hypothalamus is now activating the sympathetic nervous system, and that results in the adrenal medulla being activated, and when it does so, it releases two hormones, noradrenaline and adrenaline, both of which are then released into the bloodstream. They're very quick acting, and at the same time as the sympathetic nervous system activates the adrenal medulla, it is also going to activate a range of other tissues around the body, such as the salivary glands and the intestines and so on, by actually shutting them down and redirecting blood to places like the muscles and the legs and so on. All of these things together then combine to result in the normal response to stress in the fight or flight response. So at this stage we're just going to have a look at a few questions. State and explain 2 physical responses which occur as a result of the fight and flight response. Explain why people often feel cold in times of stress, and explain how the nervous and endocrine systems work together to enable the body to respond to danger. So that's a much longer 6-mark question. And then the function of cortisol and aldosterone. So the first question, state and explain 2 physical responses which occur as a result of the fight and flight response. So we've got any 2 named responses with an appropriate explanation. So examples would be increased heart rate, pumping blood around the body, pupil dilation to take in as much light as possible for better vision, and so on. So the ones that really belong to that table. Explain why people often feel cold in times of stress. Less blood in the skin to keep it warm, hence the skin feels cold, as the blood is being redirected to the muscles to aid movement, the ability to run. Now just have a quick look at this question. There was 2 marks here, and it's sometimes easy for people to just give the first answer, less blood going to the skin, but obviously you've stated one thing, so you would only get 1 mark. So what you need to do here is think a bit about what is happening and why is it happening. So always try to sort of explain what you have just said. So you might be saying what's going to happen, but you need to then say why did it happen. Explain how the nervous system and endocrine systems work together to enable the body to respond to danger. So this is really looking at that flow chart. So any 6th one, the danger is detected by the autonomic nervous system. Hypothalamus triggers the sympathetic nervous system. Nervous impulses trigger or release of hormones from the adrenal medulla. Adrenaline causes glycogenolysis in the liver cells, so release of glucose. And we can also refer to the second messenger model here. We've got the increased blood glucose used for respiration, increasing the energy for muscle contraction. Other appropriate hormone on response. And the pituitary gland stimulates the adrenal cortical system, and hormones are released from the adrenal cortex. And finally, the function of cortisol and aldosterone. So these play a role in short-term and long-term stress response. So firstly, stimulating the breakdown of proteins and fat into glucose. This increases the energy available for the brain and the muscles so they can respond to the situation. So this is gluconeogenesis. Increases the blood volume and pressure by increasing the uptake of sodium ions and water by the kidneys, and also that will also be assisted by the increase in glucose in the blood too. And we've also got the suppressing of the immune system, which is very likely to be an energy saving mechanism. So this is the end of this presentation on the fight or flight. And again, I hope you have had the opportunity to take down the notes that you need. And if you need to, obviously go back over it again. Thank you.